Welcome to this episode of Against the Mountains of Madness. I'm Jason Rennie, and
I'm John Wright.
And today we'll be discussing C.S. Lewis, J.R.R Tolkien, and what they got right. So, John, I should admit, at the start, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage here. I've never read Lord of the Rings. I've seen the movies, and I enjoyed them. I haven't watched the Amazon series. It sounds abysmal. But that's okay. I think we'll be fine, because I know you've read them and loved them. And I've read, again, apart from the Narnia books, I've pretty much read everything else Lewis wrote. So we'll see how we go.
If you haven't read Lord of the Rings, then you're in for a treat, and I envy you, because to read them again for the first time would be a rare treat. They are the best books of the millennium, and it's been voted that way several times by the English-speaking people in our mutual mother country of England. The intelligentsia were so outraged that they forced them to do the poll over and over again, but the public has spoken. Lord of the Rings is the best book written in the last 1,000 years. I myself think Dante can give him a run for his money. The movies were good. The filmmaker attempted to be fairly true to the original material, but in translating to the film, much was lost. Some of the main characters were changed, and some of the important some of the important moral points and insights that are in the book did not translate into the film. The filmmaker doesn't understand the nobility and tragedy of warfare, and did not portray Aragorn correctly at all, nor Faramir, nor Denethor, nor Theoden.
So what you're saying is
there were major characters that he simply did not portray correctly.
So what you're saying is he did a horrible job?
No, I'm not saying that at all. The art direction was wonderful.
Yeah, it was pretty.
The adaptation was faithful. They hired the real Gandalf to play Gandalf, and they hired the real Sam to play Sam.
Fair enough.
Some of the acting is just wonderful,
yeah.
And to bring Gollum to the screen and have him be legitimately Gollum-like, considering how little is actually visually described in Tolkien, is remarkable. And to capture the landscape by filming in New Zealand was a stroke of genius. Simply a stroke of genius.
No, fair enough.
There were certain things he exaggerated and simplified, and certain episodes he left out, including crucial episodes at the end. So I actually am sorry that you saw the film before reading the book, because the film is inferior.
Okay.
And it will fill your imagination with a false picture of what the Middle Earth is really like.
Okay.
So, now, it's funny that you say you're not a fan of fantasy, although you did like that film. What is it about fantasy that doesn't appeal to your taste?
I don't know. I think I've always preferred science fiction. I like spaceships and ray guns more than swords and dragons. I think is what it is.
That's a perfectly good.
It's very shallow.
For
it's very shallow. I will freely admit, but
no, I don't. It's perfectly fine to be shallow about something that you read for light entertainment. The appeal of fantasy, I believe, started with William Morris in the Victorian era, when the English started to become aware that the dark, dismal, smoky factories were moving into their beloved countryside, and trees that were as old as Alfred the Great were being chopped down to make way for paved roads over which lorries would be driving in belching black smoke, and the countryside was just being closed off, and everything was becoming uglified.
Yep. And
Morris wanted to write stories reminding people of what we would call the pre-Raphaelite era, the imaginary era of the Middle Ages and of the classical world, that was a little more beautiful and a little more fresh than what's gone wrong in modern civilization. Now, it's a nostalgia trip. I believe all modern fantasy is basically a nostalgia trip.
Okay.
There are two major streams of fantasy in my personal opinion.
Okay.
One springs out of J.R.R Tolkien and all his imitators, and E.R. Edison also is in that camp, even though E.R. Edison is earlier than Tolkien. Of people who try to write what one might call high fantasy that is mannered and elegant and speaks to the high ideals of chivalry and of nobility.
Yep.
And then there is what we might call blue-collar fantasy, which is much more like the Conan stories of Robert E. Howard, how can I say this? I adore them but don't agree with them, if that makes any sense.
What does
I
that
think
mean?
Howard was also tapping into the discontent that men have with civilization, particularly modern civilization, and yearning for an era which, if though more barbaric and more savage, was a little simpler and more direct.
Okay.
Having to take your enemy to court and argue with him with the help of Perry Mason can make for a good legal drama. But being able to cleave him to the brisket through his skull with a bloody axe is much more appealing, especially to the youthful
Kind of satisfying.
spirit,
Yep.
which doesn't brook any. Now, having said that, I think there is a distinction between Conan-like stories and Middle Earth type stories, between the Hyborian Age and Middle Earth.
Okay.
Both of which, by the way, are said to take place on Earth, not in another world, but just in a period of history that has been forgotten.
Okay.
See? But, of course, you can't imagine Frodo cleaving anyone with an axe. He will leave that to his friendly dwarf friend, Gimli,
Yes.
son of Glóin. So, in our discussion here, we want to talk about what Tolkien and Lewis did right. And I am glad that you've read Lewis's Space Trilogy.
Oh, I loved it.
Because I actually think that's among his best work.
I think so.
I've also read and enjoyed his scholarly work, which is neither his apologetics, which I also recommend to anyone to read, atheist or Christian, and his fantasy work and his children's books. Let me also say a word as to what the appeal of ray guns and spaceships are, because I'm also a fan and writer of science fiction. In the same way that when the Industrial Revolution started moving into England, people started having nostalgic pangs for the Middle Ages and for the classical period that they've lost. They also started wondering, sometimes with glee and sometimes with terror, about what the future held. And there was enough of an awareness that the technological changes introduced by the industrial and scientific revolutions would change the way their children and grandchildren lived, that it became an interesting matter of speculation to them. What's interesting is that H.G. Wells and Jules Verne were not regarded as writers in a separate genre when they first started writing. The Mary Shelley was not regarded as being separate from other Gothic-type novels.
Okay.
Wells was simply a guy who wrote speculative kind of fiction, and the Americans, who were much more interested in the Industrial Revolution and trying to catch up to the English, made their pulp magazines, their adventure magazines. Some of them became specialized into just future war stories or futuristic fiction, which is where we get Hugo Gernsback and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And it really took off in the 50s, and it since has kind of it became mainstream after Star Wars and Star Trek, which we discussed in an earlier period.
Yes.
But the question we're discussing now is, what did Tolkien and Lewis do right that The Last Jedi and Star Trek Discovery did wrong?
Yes. Well, seeing as The Last Jedi The Last Jedi is kind of fantasy, but Star Trek Discovery is definitely science fiction.
I would say that space opera is still science fiction, although
Okay.
Really hardcore science fiction writers don't like to admit that. It does have fantasy elements though to it as well, though. It's meant to the opening of Star Wars is meant to remind you of a fairy tale.
But so what did Lewis do right with his space trilogy that they did wrong? Because I loved the space trilogy. It's definitely very space opera, and you can tell.
No, it's not space opera at all.
It's not?
Space opera is Lensman series by Doc E. Smith.
Okay.
It depends on gigantism and splendid special effects. If you don't have a planet get blown up in a science fiction story, it's not a space opera.
I know what I meant to say.
What it was quite the contrary. It was a Victorian science fiction story. It was a science fiction story much along the same lines as anything written by H.G. Wells or Olaf Stapledon. And in my opinion, better than them in some respects. I'm actually shocked that C.S. Lewis does not get more respect from science fiction writers for having written some of the best early science fiction in the field. And I think it's only because they're prejudiced against Christians. I can't see any other reason.
No, fair enough.
So let me tell you my theory. Let me tell you my theory about H.G. Wells, C.S. Lewis, and Arthur C. Clarke, and tell you what they got right and wrong. H.G. Wells, when he wrote First Men in the Moon, could not match Jules Verne's technical accuracy when he thought that a lunar mission would take place by being shot through the Columbiad gun from the peninsula of Florida, which in fact is where the moonshot actually was launched from, although it was a rocket and not a gun.
Yep.
And I don't see how Verne could have predicted that correctly. But he picked that spot because the closer to the equator you are, the better the orbital mechanics are for achieving orbit.
Mm-hmm.
And Jules Verne got all his technical details correct. Now, H.G. Wells wrote a slightly different form of science fiction. Jules Verne wrote what we would now call techno-thrillers, speculations about inventions that were only a few years in the future.
Mm-hmm.
H.G. Wells was a socialist writing social commentary, usually negative, and he wanted to use the moon the way Gulliver and Gulliver's Travel, the way Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels used some far island like the land of the Houyhnhnms or the land of Laputa. Okay, He just wanted it to be a spot where he could put some of his ideas of a socialist commonwealth on stage. In terms of the science fiction of it, Wells is a little fast and loose with the science.
Yeah.
He proposes that there's an anti-gravity metal that can block gravity. He correctly deduces what would happen if you had such a thing by having a certain disaster flatten the house of the scientist who Cavour is the name of the scientist who invents it.
Mm-hmm.
But things like having the moon have plant growth during the daytime, have an atmosphere, and have an ocean in the middle of it were just his own inventions. It's ironic that his depiction of the moon, even though Wells is regarded as a hard SF writer, as a mainstream SF writer,
Yep.
are less accurate than Edgar Rice Burroughs or C.S. Lewis's depictions of Mars. So, but be that as it may, let me mention something about Wells. So Wells writes the story where he proposes that the future of mankind is going to be expansion across the other planets and out into space, and that men are going to be like gods. You'll see this also in Things to Come, which was made into a rather nice movie in the 30s, by the way, a rather accurate movie. Now, C.S. Lewis did not think that man going into space would create anything new in the human condition other than what happened when Europeans went to the New World or went to Australia. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
So he wanted to say that if we visited other worlds, that they might be something more like what the medieval conception of those worlds were, which is to say that there would be some sort of divine nature there that's not here on Earth because Earth is a fallen planet. Hence his book, Out from the Silent Planet,
Yep.
is the reason why Thulkandra, the silent planet, is us, is because we're quarantined from the rest of the universe because we're fallen beings and the other beings on the other worlds are not.
Now be corrupted by us.
Right, they'd be corrupted by us. So when in terms of the actual science, there's only one gaffe that I think C.S. Lewis makes, which is when he describes his space travelers in zero gravity wearing weight belts like a deep sea diver to keep their feet oriented toward the center of the craft. That's just an absurdity. It would not work that way. The belt would be weightless too. Nearly everything else he got correct, although he did not seem to understand how freefall worked or how when you're approaching a planet, it doesn't suddenly shift your gravity so that the planet below you is down unless you're not falling toward it. If you're falling toward it, you're still in freefall. I also was amused by the fact that his spaceship, like the spaceship of Cavour in H.G. Wells, merely had a screw that you unscrewed to get out. And by the way, the Martians in War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells also had the same thing. None of these people have airlocks on their spaceships. Yep. Okay, because of course the atmosphere is just perfectly fine on the planet Mars, or Malacandra as we call it. Now, everything else he basically got correct. Now Mars is not inhabitable, mind you, but he decided to use the same kind of assumptions that the scientists at the time thought were the case. It was the standard theory. It was the mainstream theory that Mars was an older planet than us, and Venus was younger. Okay. And that was not something the science fiction writers made up. The canals of Mars, some people knew were really something that was an optical illusion created by a dirty lens or something. But others thought there might be these long straight tracks somewhere on the surface of Mars. And every science fiction writer who has mentioned them, including people like Edgar Rice Burroughs, who is someone who would not expect to be scientifically accurate, correctly deduces that the things must be hundreds of miles wide. So C.S. Lewis made them deep trenches in the surface of the planet. And the planet was uninhabitable because of an ancient war between Thulkandra and Malacandra, between two of the super beings that live in outer space. And one of the things that is scientifically accurate and is kind of astonishing is, of course, both Wells and Lewis decided that traveling in space would be an eerie, almost otherworldly, literally otherworldly experience if you were in zero gravity and exposed to the sunlight at all times.
Yep.
But Lewis decided to make it also kind of spiritual, because he thought that the outer space might very well be filled with immaterial energy beings, or basically angelic spirits, called Eldil, and that the place would actually be crowded instead of empty.
Yep.
You know, so it's a brilliant conceit, And when he gets to Mars, Ransom undergoes the same kind of adventures that you would expect from Robinson Crusoe or Gulliver's Travels or any of these other, exploratory books. He is a philologist instead of an adventurer, and so of course he learns how to speak the native language
Yep.
by way of getting to the natives. And in order to kind of rebuke Wells, he has a conversation translated by Ransom, the main character, between Weston. And by the way, I should interrupt myself and say, both Wells and Lewis have their round spaceship being crewed by three men: a scientist representing Western science, a businessman representing Western industry, and the main character. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, excuse me, not the main character. Wells only has two. Lewis has three. My mistake. So Weston is going to explain to the natives of Malcandra, whom he regards as inferior to himself. He regards them as being just aborigines that the West is going to roll over the
Yep.
way in Lewis's day and earlier the West did roll over many Aboriginal nations and tribes,
Mm-hmm.
and explain that it was the glorious destiny of mankind to colonize these places and to enlighten them and to wipe out any opposition, because every organism has to struggle with every other organism. And he basically lays forth a sort of Darwinian war of all against all and says that his side is going to win.
Mm.
And when he's translating all these glorious highfalutin terms to the Eldil of Mars, Ransom, the translator, has to translate them literally into what the terms actually mean. And once they're stripped of their connotations, and you only hear the denotations of the word, you realize that Weston is saying something that's simply horrible and stupid.
Mm.
Because the surprise twist of the end of Malacandra, of the Out from the Silent Planet, is that these Aborigines are not inferior to the West in any way, shape, or form, but are superior because they're unfallen beings.
Yep.
They don't have original sin, okay? They don't have war, they don't have disease, so on and so forth. So, the second book in the series, Purilendra, I believe, was C.S. Lewis rebuking the future story of H.G. Wells' The Time Traveler.
Okay.
In the Time Traveler, H.G. Wells
Yep.
has his narrator, his unnamed narrator, go to the far future and see what the degeneration that will happen if England does not adopt socialist policies and maintains a class distinction between the upper and the lower classes. And it's a well-written book, but it's of course absurd. It's scientifically absurd because you have to assume the class system would exist over geologic ages long enough to induce physiological changes in the two subspecies of mankind. But granted that, the H.G. Wells book is set up as a kind of creepy detective story as the time traveler slowly discovers what the future holds, because he doesn't understand what he's seeing at first, and he goes through several wrong theories as to what's going on. And I do notice that the time machine lands at the foot of the Sphinx, who is the one who asks the question, "What is man?"
Yep.
And of course, Wells's point in the time machine is that man is not free from the Darwinian law that will turn man into an animal if that's what's advantageous for him in an evolutionary sense. Now, Wells, of course, does not believe in this socialist theory of mankind. He doesn't think that Darwinian evolution makes it so that we're always at odds with each other. He believes in things like love and compassion, justice can be had, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
He believes in the Christian worldview.
Yep.
So he sets his second novel, and he has some very odd similarities to events in the Time Traveler. For example, the Time Traveler, when he comes back from the future, in the H.G. Wells book, has some flowers in his pocket that were put there by Weena, one of the Eloi. Likewise, Ransom has some of the blooms that were packed into his space traveling coffin from Purulendra. When the time traveler comes back, he is weary and eager for some food, something other than fruit, which is the only thing that Eloi eat, and looks haggard.
Yep.
When Ransom comes back, because he was in Eden, because he was in an unfallen world, he is so robust that he thinks his friend is sick, and he eats a breakfast rather than a dinner, and he has a hearty appetite rather than being sickly. And it's kind of playing with a time travel book because he's going back to Eden, or he's actually going to the Eden of a different planet where the same problem is set up, where the serpent, in this case in the form of Weston, the unman, is trying to tempt Eve, the Eve of that world, the Green Lady.
Yep.
You say, and unfortunately, Ransom finds he cannot out-debate the fellow, so he has to take matters more into his own hands in a fashion which will strike some readers as a little untoward. But I remind everyone that World War II was going on at that time, and sometimes you don't settle things with debate.
No.
You see. Now, the best of his books takes place on Earth and is called That Hideous Strength. And yes. I wish it were a science fiction book instead of an accurate portrayal of the times in which we currently live.
Yep.
I don't. Now, here's what's odd about that. Both he and G.K. Chesterton made, when they decided to write fantasy stories or science fiction stories or imaginative stories, made extremely accurate predictions about things to come. Whereas people like Robert Heinlein, whom I rather enjoyed when I read him in my youth, did not. And Isaac Asimov had some of the worst and silliest extrapolations or predictions one could possibly imagine. And Asimov had the effrontery, mind you, to criticize 1984 by George Orwell as being unrealistic because he said a socialist nation would never act that way. That people would not actually just give in to tyranny or adopt false ways of speaking, and he chides George Orwell for saying that the people in the 40 years from now will not use ballpoint pens but will instead use steel nib pens. That's Asimov thinking that he's got it down pat. He's got the future in his pocket. I don't think I've ever read anything as shallow as that because 1984, all it is was taking things that George Orwell had already seen with his eyes taking place in Spain and in other places overseas, or reading the newspapers from the Soviet Union, and just placing that in England. There's no scientific advances in there except for maybe the two-way televisions that allow the Big Brother to watch you. So Asimov could only extrapolate really shallow ideas. Asimov, in several of his stories, I realize we're not supposed to be talking about Asimov, but if I may just
it's okay.
Go into this rabbit hole for just a second. I promise I'll pop back out the other side as quickly as I can. In his most famous story, Nightfall, Asimov, at the urging of John W. Campbell Jr., thought that they would tweak the nose of the poet Emerson, who said that if the stars only rose once every 1,000 years, men would be so awed that they would bow down and adore God. Now, both these men were atheists, and they thought that men would not adore God, but they thought that if the stars only showed up once every 1,000 years, people would go mad. So Asimov made a rather astronomically unrealistic planet that is in a multiple star system, and only has nightfall once every 1,000 years. Presumably nightfall only on one hemisphere of the planet. I'm not sure how you would arrange the eclipses otherwise to have it be any other way.
Who knows?
And of course, everyone immediately goes mad because it's dark and they don't have any light. They never invented the light bulb, and in order to get light, they need to start burning things, and so they burn their civilization. Now, like H.G. Wells, the thing is set up like a detective story, and the clues come on stage only one step at a time. It's really well constructed. Asimov deserves his fame for the cleverness of the story. It's a good story, but it's as shallow as it's completely two-dimensional. Humans don't act that way. Okay, Asimov's robots are more realistic than his humans because at least they have 3 laws of robotics, whereas his humans only have 1. His law of humanics, Asimov's law of humanity is that people go crazy when they're taken out of their environment. Now, here's what I notice. Let me give you another example. In Caves of Steel and in The Naked Sun, he assumes that an overpopulation will make the future Earth so crowded that everyone will live in underground warrens, so that they're all agoraphobic. They can't go outside without a sense of terror because they're not used to going outside. Okay? And in The Naked Sun, he assumes that the colonies around the star Sirius are so underpopulated that every human lives surrounded by a plethora of robots to serve his bidding, and that no humans ever meet other humans. He doesn't say how they reproduce on that point. So that actually meeting another human being causes them such anxiety that they go insane. Okay. Asimov's humans only have two modes, off, on, and insane.
Yes.
They only have two on and off switch. And the idea that people are so plastic and that human nature is not the same, and that human nature is shaped entirely by your means of production, or entirely by your environment, or entirely by the technology surrounding you, is an interesting speculation for a science fiction story, but it's not true to nature. So his extrapolations are ridiculous.
Well,
overpopulation is not the problem in the world these days.
No.
Underpopulation is.
Yeah.
Just for example. Okay. Now, why did C.S. Lewis get everything accurate and correct when he was talking about the NICE? There's even a bureau in England to this day.
There is, yes.
Which decides who lives and who dies according to their enlightened socialistic medicine.
And
because whatever you ration, whatever you socialize, you have to ration.
yes.
If the free market doesn't decide where it goes, then a commissar has to decide. And when you're talking about medical care, the commissar decides who lives and who dies. Well, the board that decides who lives and who dies is called the NICE.
Yep.
in England, in reality. The NICE in the book do fake news. One of Mark Studdock's missions is to write a fake news story. They don't believe in Christianity, but they do have an odd belief in some sort of macroscopic life form. They kind of combine the desires of medieval wizards with the ambitions of mad scientists. They think they can control humanity. They are opposed to things like orgasms, organisms, and life. They depict the moon. Life on the moon is only sterilized on our side. This is before the moonshot. This is before anyone saw the dark side of the moon, the far side of the moon. And so he has the far side of the moon being a place where the original inhabitants of Sulva, as it's called, Luna, are being slowly exterminated as the trees die off and the atmospheric creeps in smaller and smaller, because the non-organic life forms that are replacing them work for the macroscopic life forms, which we find out later are devils.
Yeah.
Okay? But the way the bureaucracy works, everything it does when it acts, the way they talk, the way the progressive element at the college talks, all completely accurate.
Yep.
All exactly what you would expect. And the name, the hideous strength, the word strength doesn't mean strength of your arm. The word strength there means a stronghold, means a tower. And it refers to the Tower of Babel, which our intelligentsia, as in the book, are trying to establish in the real world right now, even as we speak. See?
They are. We have a crop of neo-Babelists running around today. You think
the
they'd learn?
confusion of tongues. The confusion of tongues has already descended upon them because they can't even tell you what a woman is.
Well, that's true.
Words don't mean anything coming out of their mouths anymore.
What is it with moderns who read dystopian tales and go, this seems like a good blueprint?
I'm not sure they're quite aware of what they're doing.
I have to wonder
every
time
because I think that all that's going on is that George Orwell depicted the Soviet mindset, and the Soviet mindset is based on Marxism, which is a Christian heresy. It's an attempt to have the apocalypse of St. John and the New Jerusalem without God. Is basically what it is.
Yep.
Marx did not write economics. Economists talk about things like trade deficits and marginal income tax rates and how that affects your productivity. Marx didn't talk about that. Marx talked about how unfair it was that people had to work for a living, and that that there was a conspiracy theory of some sort of capitalist class, international capitalist class, that all cooperated for their mutual benefit, and that the inevitable historical processes, in other words, the goddess fate, that a divine superhuman power known as the material dialectic of history was going to overthrow capitalism in a bloody revolution, and that A, it's inevitable, and B, you have to give your utmost efforts to helping it out. Now, A and B are mutually contradictory. Okay, it's a religious cult. It's a vision of the future. It's a vision of a future where everyone is equal. There's no family.
Of course.
There's nothing to live or die for. There's no religion. I believe one of the Beatles summed up the vision of Marx in a short and thoroughly disgusting and silly song.
Yes.
Which takes away everything one would actually live for in life, or everything a family would need. You see. So once people are naked under the eye of Sauron, once people are have no family and no local loyalties, no church and no community, and it's just them and the omnipotent power of the state, then suddenly, for no reason, the state will wither away and all goods and services will be produced for free without the need for a law of cause and effect or a law of supply and demand. That's Marx's vision. It is so silly that no one could believe it unless he really wanted to believe it, unless he really was religiously motivated to take it on faith, even though he doesn't understand it. So I believe that all these leftists take on faith something they don't understand. It's a type of Gnosticism,
of course,
where they think they have an inner reality that is more real than real reality. Now, to draw it back to what we were talking about, Tolkien and Lewis, the reason why Lewis's space trilogy is so insightful and so real is because his worldview is real. He's telling the truth about true things. The reason why Isaac Asimov, and I don't mean to pick on him, he's a good writer, is so shallow, is that he's a good writer, but he writes of shallow things. His scientific speculations about the way robots would be better at running the world than men would be, because they can't harm human beings, is juvenile. As if he thinks that harm is the source of all evil, that physical harm is what makes things bad.
Yep.
Would a robot stop a person from... I mean, I should mention that the guy who wrote Legion of Time, Jack Williamson wrote a series of short stories called The Humanoids, where he actually had the robots act so as to prevent people from hurting themselves. And basically what the robots did was take away all human freedom. Okay? They made it so that you couldn't do anything. You couldn't take a stiff drink because the alcohol might hurt you. You couldn't walk down the stairs without the robot carrying you because you might tremble and take a spill. Okay?
Yeah.
I mean, Jack Williamson actually had Asimov's number down pat. He saw what would actually happen. But in the robot short stories of Asimov, he starts by making the first two stories are kind of puzzle box stories where there's a puzzle as to what's going wrong with the robot, and Susan Calvin, obviously a Calvinist, doesn't believe in free will, solves the problem by figuring out which of the three laws of robotics are overriding which of the other three. Okay? And the robots both are self-aware but don't have free will, which, I mean, explain that to me. I'm not sure how that's supposed to work theologically or logically. But at the end two stories, the end has the human race secretly being taken over by robots because the robots are so moral because they don't let people hurt themselves that they can be trusted where humans cannot be. The machinery of government can be trusted even though the government cannot be. He has a similar conceit with his Foundation trilogy, which is perhaps his most famous work.
Yep.
Where he just assumes that once human nature can mathematically be predicted and the future can be established, that all the mathematicians who then will direct how history is going to go, using the very same forces Marx talked about, the historical inevitability of certain events, and I'm still puzzled as to how the events can both be inevitable and be subject to the Selden plan that Selden sets in motion, but let's never mind that. Let's assume he's like an economist who predicts what things will happen if not otherwise interfered with. Okay, so he's a super economist, and what he wants to do is revive the empire after the empire falls, and there's not a single line of dialogue anywhere in all three books, and he wrote more after that, where someone says, "Wait a minute, I'd rather live in a republic. I don't want to live in an empire." So yours truly wrote a book that had a similar make-believe predictive history science that I just said the aliens made up. You know, it's magic. It's a magic trick. It's not. It's just something the reader has to grant me, otherwise I can't tell the story.
Fair enough.
But if you grant me that such a mathematics could exist, my question is, well, why wouldn't a guy, let's say someone from Texas, a cowboy from Texas, say, I don't want no galactic empire. I want a republic.
Of course.
You know, so Let's introduce vectors into history that'll mess up your plans. See?
Of course.
Now, that strikes me as being slightly less shallow than Asimov's idea that things will just progress to more and more levels of perfection. Because his idea of perfection was getting rid of religion, for one thing. Or Heinlein's idea of perfection was getting rid of the sexual mores that the Martians don't pay attention to in a book that is not called Stranger in a Strange Bed. Now,
and we've done that. And how's that working out?
There's nothing like. Yeah, it's working out with the suicide rate among women is high. That's how that's working out.
Well, yes.
Compare that with the way the marriage of Mark and Jane Studdock is treated in That Hideous Strength. Even though it was remarkably unpopular at the time it was written, and perhaps even more unpopular now, the Eldil of outer space are very old-fashioned and think that the wife should submit to her husband and should bear him children. You know, and if she doesn't do so, it's bad for the Jane Studdock was, according to the magician Merlin, who's a character in the book, and a very well-drawn character indeed, there's supposed to be a prophetic child born of Jane Studdock, but she adopted the sterile practices of Sulva, the moon, and took artificial contraception. Now, it's funny that he makes that a sticking point, even though he's not a Catholic himself. He's fairly close, though. He's a traditionalist.
He was a pretty traditional Anglican.
He's a guy that every denomination... I've never met a Christian denomination who didn't like them, except for some hardcore evangelistics don't like the fact that he has magic in his Narnia.
Yeah, I've met a couple that don't
his
like
magic
him,
is expressly forbidden by the Christian religion.
Have you read... well, I assume you've read the Screwtape Letters? That's one of my favorite of Lewis's books as well.
Yes.
Just a wonderful... Apparently, he had a thought to try to write the opposite side of the Screwtape Letters, but could never figure out how to write the angelic advice. He just knew he'd never be able to do it, and gave up. But
because to know what the tempter would say, all you have to do is look into your own heart.
That's true.
But to know what pure love would be, I mean, the darkness doesn't understand the light, and we're in the twilight.
That's true.
We're in the Twilight Lands now. We're in the Shadowlands, so we can't really comprehend what true love would be like. You need to talk to Christ for things like that. You need to find out from the Virgin Mary what it's like to be without sin.
That's true.
You know?
But yes.
Now I do like the fact that in one of his essays, he mentions what a truly Christian commonwealth would be like, and he said there's a lot of things on the right that the right would not like, and a lot of things on the political left that the left would not like.
Of course.
And no one would. There's parts that people would like, but no one would like the whole thing. See.
That would make sense.
And I think that is amazingly insightful. And to get back to the original question, the reason why The Last Jedi, for example, is a work of garbage is because the only thing the author was doing there was subverting viewer expectations.
Yep.
He didn't have a sequel in mind. In fact, he tried to make the sequel as hard as possible to be made, if I read his character correctly, which I may not be.
Yeah.
But what he did was he took all the rules of normal storytelling and thought by merely breaking those rules, he could produce something interesting and entertaining. He was quite wrong. This was not interesting or entertaining. In fact, it was an insult. It was the guy was making fun of me and of everyone who likes space opera and who likes simple, straightforward adventure stories. Okay.
Yep.
And it was politically correct and therefore boring.
Of course.
Now, here's the puzzle. Why is political correctness boring where other political theories such as monarchy or imperialism or even a direct democracy are not boring? Well, the reason why is because those other theories are based on an understanding of human nature, the way it actually works. But the Last Jedi, which takes place in a galaxy long, long ago, far, far away, doesn't take place with human characters that are understandable, you know.
Yeah.
But the way Mark Studdock acts in That Hideous Strength, and the way Merlin acts, and the way the director acts, and the way the bum who likes toasted cheese acts. Do you remember the bum?
No, I do not.
One of my favorite characters.
It's been a while.
You should reread That Hideous Strength if you don't remember the bum.
Okay.
Because there's a class distinction present in the book, which American readers will tend to overlook because we live in a There's no formal classes in our society, in American society. They're informal, but there's no legal privileges maintaining them, unlike in England.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't like them. We want to have our top aristocrats dressed in the same black or brown suit that our working men dress in,
Yep.
But in England, it's very important. The middle class doesn't want to rub elbows with the upper class, and the lower class doesn't want to rub elbows with the middle class. So when Mark Studdock is arrested by the secret police of the NICE, he's thrown into a jail cell with a bum. Okay, and the bum has a very never mind. I won't bother to try and describe it. The bum is the guy that Merlin tries to pretend is actually the real Merlin, and he's willing to go along with the trick because he just thinks it's amusing. Okay.
Yep.
And his goals are very earthy and straightforward. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the other thing I like about that his strength, and one reason why I think the book is a classic. The various bad guys all represent, and live out a different form of one modernistic worldview or another. One of the guys is a crass materialist, for example. The other guy is a mystic of the most nihilistic sort. Another guy is a guy who tries to use Christianity as an excuse for preaching socialism.
Yep.
The Hardcastle is a lesbian, even though that word is never used in the text because Lewis was too delicate and the times would not have permitted it, and so on and so forth. And almost all of them, if not all of them, I think almost all of them, are killed or come to a bad end because their own worldview comes into being around them. Okay? The guy who thinks that words have no meaning ends up not being able to speak words. Mm. The guy who says that his body is a robot and his mind is a distraction finds his body operating in a robot-like fashion. The person who has nothing but contempt for animals is torn to pieces by animals, and so on and so forth. Okay.
Yep.
The Tower of Babel does fall there, and poetic justice is done. Because Lewis had a correct. Basically, the answer is Lewis had a correct view of human nature, and so his predictions are accurate because they were based on accurate. They were clear-sighted. His stories are interesting because they deal with realistic people, even if the realistic people are in unrealistic, fantastical circumstances. Whereas the guys who get it wrong because what they're portraying is not a human being. Mm. It's an Asimovian robot.
Yep.
Or it's a nymph from Robert Heinlein.
Yes.
Just someone who can have sex with no consequences. Okay.
Well, yes.
Which is not the way sex works.
No.
Sorry, Heinlein. And you shouldn't have lied. And you shouldn't have lied to a child when you wrote that book. So.
Have you read The Great Divorce? It's actually one of my favorites.
Yes.
I love that book.
Yes.
It's a fascinating depiction of hell. Well, it's not really hell. It's pre-hell.
It's limbo, but it's close enough to hell.
Yes. Well, it'll be hell when the sun rises, or when the darkness finally sets. However you want to look at it, but it's fascinating the characters he has in hell, or has in the town, in the dreary town. The theology professor who didn't want to go and visit the outskirts of heaven on the bus, but preferred to stay for a lecture and a debate about the nature of God. It's like, I know people like that. I've met people that come across like that, and it's just, it's sad. The people are just sort of broken and selfish and reduced to. At least the people in the town before he travels to the outskirts of heaven are just reduced to all the goodness has been taken out of their lives. Like they've been reduced to what they always wanted to be, and it's a fascinating depiction. I've always found Lewis's depiction of hell quite fascinating, appropriate. Like. I agree with his sort of contention that hell, for all of its awfulness, is where people that don't want God and want to put themselves on that throne. This is really the only appropriate place for them, and nothing can be done for them. This is what they want, so it's giving them what they desire in the end. even though it's horrible, but it's what they want.
As Lewis himself said, the choice is a binary. Either you say to God, "Thy will be done," or God says to you, "Thy will be done." And what humans will for themselves is not good.
No.
I imagine us as being something like a flaccid balloon. Unless God, the Spirit, is breathed into us, we're not going to be nice and plump and round and firm. We're just going to be droopy things. And the creatures in hell in his books,
Yep.
just are slowly or quickly drained of any last residue of the things that once made them good. You see, and I particularly like his depiction of the devils as in Screwtape Letters.
Yep.
As being in the midst of a bureaucracy of loveless competition
And noise.
where all they're going to do is end up eating each other.
Yep.
Because when they have great affection for each other, what they actually have is appetite for each other.
Yep.
And I do think it's also more realistic than... I'm a big fan of Milton, and I do like the romanticized idea of the devil who is being portrayed in Paradise Lost as a glorified pagan hero. There are people, unfortunately, who don't understand Milton, who seem to think that the pagans were the good guys in Milton's puritanical worldview. That is not the case. What Milton is doing is showing the hollowness of Satan in his poem. As Lewis himself, in his preface to Paradise Lost, writes, Satan makes several speeches during Milton's long epic poem, and all of them start by talking about things like the public weal and the destiny of demonkind, and end up with him talking about himself and justifying himself and bellyaching about himself. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, the people who are deceived by the glories of how impressive the king of rebels is in Milton, will not be deceived by how glorious the petty, fussy bureaucrat in Screwtape Letters is, even though those are the same character.
Yeah.
The one leads to the other. The one is a false appearance that actually has the other one in mind. You see? Because once again, Lewis is insightful. Now, Lewis is not only insightful, but also, and I should say Tolkien as well, their works are theologically correct. It's very difficult to keep a proper theology, to keep a proper philosophy in writing a book, because drama would prefer to have worldly philosophy paramount. Here's what I mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
In a detective story, you want to have a bloody murder, and you want it to be as grotesque as possible, and not necessarily grotesque as possible, but you want it to be lurid, okay? And you want it to be clever, and you want the detective to be able to figure it out by piecing clues together.
Yep.
Or if it's a Mike Hammer story, to beat it out of the bad guys by giving them the third degree, or what have you. If it's a romance story, you want to have it be erotic. You want to have it be romantic.
Mm-hmm.
But to write something like a children's story, like a Narnia story, and to actually have Christ come on stage in a disguise as a pantomime line, and to portray him correctly, and to put him across with the same strangeness and wonder and fear that must have been in the hearts of the people in first century Palestine when they saw this figure who could heal the sick and raise the dead, but then who ended up dying. I mean, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe actually tells the story of the Passion of Christ.
Yep.
If it took place in make-believe animal land, okay.
Yep.
And he did not try to make up a very thorough... His world building was inferior to that of Tolkien, only because everyone's world building is inferior to that of Tolkien. Tolkien spent his entire life inventing his legendarium, inventing his background history, that he filled in with excruciating detail. Because what he was trying to do was to pen something like an Iliad and the Odyssey for England, if England had had a literary history reaching back to the Bronze Age, which it did not, you see. And he wanted to have some of the Norse flavor, of the Norse myths, informing the background, because he was both he and Lewis were quite enamored of the Wagner and of the Norse mythology, of the fatalism, the stoical courage, and so on and so forth. So what Tolkien wanted to do, and I don't think this is a speculation on my part. I think this is a fairly well-received mainstream theory of Tolkien's approach. Tolkien looked at Beowulf, which he also helped translate. He has his own translation of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he taught. And he said, this is how an epic poem set in the pagan days, written by a Christian, should be done. There are people who debate about the identity of the poet who wrote Beowulf. But I side with those who say it was a Christian writing about his pagan ancestors. And he wanted to do it in a way that glorified those ancestors without saying that they were correct in their paganism. There's a passage or two in Beowulf where he admits they committed human sacrifice and did other things that would not be done this day. But it is noteworthy that the monster in Beowulf is provoked by the poets in Heorot, the Golden Hall, which shows up, I think, in disguise in Medusel, the Golden Hall of Theoden in Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. The song of the poet is about creation, is about the creator, is about the bountiful earth with the riches of greenery poured into its lap, and the sun and the moon, as silver and gold in the sky hung up as lanterns. And so in Beowulf, the pagan background is used to portray kind of a Christian myth, but because it's pre-Christian, the hero has to come to a melancholy end. Well, in Lord of the Rings, a very similar thing is done.
Okay.
Frodo cannot simply triumph over the lure of the ring. In fact, spoilers, since you saw the movie, he gives into it. He caves.
Right at the end, yeah.
Okay. It is divine grace that allows him to prevail nonetheless. But even then, and this part was abbreviated in the movie, and I think to its detriment.
Okay.
He cannot fit in again into the normal life of Hobbiton. He cannot get over the wounds he suffered and the nightmares and the loss. So he has to leave the world. He has to go off away to Valinor, the paradise of the elves.
Yep.
Across the Sundering Sea. Now that's a metaphor for death, but it's also a metaphor for a paradise beyond death.
Okay.
Now it's hard. It's not a simple metaphor. Nothing in Tolkien is a simple metaphor. Lewis in that sense is a lot more straightforward. Aslan is Christ.
Yes.
There's no two ways about it.
No subtlety whatsoever.
But Gandalf is not Christ, nor is Aragorn, nor is Frodo. Though one is a prophet, one is a king, and one is a priest. In a certain way. The priest being the one who makes the sacrifice. Okay? And the interesting thing about Tolkien is that he did not go with a hero who was big and strong and brave and bold. He went with an overweight, middle-class, middle-aged squire from rural England who kind of was lured by the glamour of adventure, but kind of also cherished his small little shire, which is called rather unsurprisingly the Shire, as his home. Okay. The message in the pre-Christian world is very melancholy. The people in the Middle Earth fight without any hope, and they go and they think they're going to be destroyed. And when hope beyond hope comes, and their foe, their supernatural foe, is overcome, there's lines in the book, which I don't believe are in the movie, saying this itself is only temporary. The shadow will retreat and take another form and will come again, because it's only going to be cured when the entire world is overthrown at the end of time. You see,
I'm gonna have to read the book, aren't I? Books.
You don't think of it as a chore. It is delightful. It will charm you. It'll make you think about things you've never thought about before.
Okay.
I mean, it's actually the best book I've ever read, and I envy you for the. Now, if you haven't read War and Peace by Tolstoy, that's also a really good book. Though I think Tolkien is better, but not by a lot, because Tolstoy also understood human nature really well. The difference is that Tolstoy had a theory of the inevitability of history, that his daemon was not which inspired his philosophy, was not as smart as his muse, which inspired his writing. That happens to a lot of writers.
Yep. Have you read? Oh, another Lewis book I enjoyed that I've read a couple of times. Have you read?
Yes.
The Pilgrim's Regress.
Yes.
Okay.
You're probably wondering why I was able to answer the question before you finished.
You've read them all.
I read them all. I read everything.
Yeah.
I read everything he's written, except for Letters to Malcolm. That's still on my list of books to read.
Okay. I enjoyed The Pilgrim's Regress. It's another one of those very unsubtle Lewis metaphors where...
Well, he was deliberately being unsubtle there. He was writing allegory.
Well, I mean, yes.
Okay.
He was writing a sort of sequel to the also particularly unsubtle John Bunyan work,
Yeah,
The Pilgrim's Progress.
which is also worth reading, by the way.
It's excellent.
Because allegory, allegory when it's done right, is like a stiff drink of uncut wine. It's like a shot in the arm. It's not meant to be read as a novel. It's not meant to be read for the complexity of the human characters involved.
No.
The whole point of an allegory is that the guy named Vanity is vain, and the guy named Pride is proud. Okay.
The town of Claptrap is full of people speaking claptrap.
Yeah, the Vanity Fair is filled with vanities, and the Slough of Despond is filled with despair. Exactly right. It's a way to. It's more like a parable, except for the real parables in the Bible are actually layered with levels of subtlety and meaning, much more so than Bunyan is. But Bunyan I like. I especially like the fight scene between Satan and the Pilgrim, which I wasn't expecting in the middle of a otherwise, I didn't like the sequel as much, where the wife goes. That's just not as good, and I didn't get to the end of it.
I haven't read that one.
I assume she gets to the divine city and lives happily ever after. So call me a Philistine. I couldn't get through it. But Tolkien did say that he mistrusted allegory as soon as he was old enough to learn what it was.
Yes.
And if you notice how subtle his symbolism is in his books, where every character has layers of meaning, and it could be a symbol for one thing or another, and it's as if he plants a seed in the field of your mind, but if you haven't prepared the field, you're not going to get much out of it. You see. Now, since you're not a guy who likes fantasy, the nostalgic appeal of the fantasy might not appeal to you. But if you like the movies, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't like it. I mean, think of it as a historical novel, which is taking place during prehistory, during a period of time that has since been lost.
Yep. Okay, I'll definitely I'll suck it up and I'll give it a go. I'm pretty sure you're right. I'll probably enjoy them. I just need to get.
Maybe they're not to everyone's taste. I mean, I'm sorry. You might read the first chapter and go, "What is this?"
Yep.
It does happen. There are people who complain that it's slow, and I did not find it so even as a child. Though I do admit that when I reread it I reread it like maybe once a year, every year, from like 13 to 33. Okay.
Yep.
And the only reason I haven't reread it more recently is because I practically have the thing memorized. But you'll appreciate it more if you have some understanding of the medieval and classical tradition that he's writing from. And you'll understand it better if you understand that he was trying to write a modern realistic novel, and he was doing it better than modern realists were.
Okay.
By using a fantastical element of prehistory, back when Earth was Middle Earth, which is just a name from Norse mythology, by the way, Midgard, and trying to show what the English spirit was long before there was an England. The man is just, he poured so much of his life and love into this. I read the Silmarillion also with great interest, but it's basically a collection of fragmentary tales edited together by his son. The Rings of Power TV show was supposed to be based on, I believe, just the appendices to Lord of the Rings, which contained some of the material in the Silmarillion. But I could be wrong about this, but I believe they couldn't get the intellectual property rights to the Silmarillion. So they just made up something, or they took something from a Dragons video game or something, and shoved that in, and tried to use it as a vehicle to put across modern woke ideology, which is basically cultural Marxism. The modern woke ideology says that there's oppressors and oppressed, and the only story they ever tell is about the oppressed becoming enlightened, becoming Gnostic, becoming aware that they are being oppressed. And that doesn't really fit together with Tolkien's vision of the Second Age, for sure. Because Sauron is an archangel of evil. He's the sort of Melkor, who is the devil, who's a rebel spirit against Eru the One. Okay?
Okay.
And so everything the Dark Lord does is meant to tempt, beguile, and domineer. And to have your main character be Xena warrior princess not only makes no sense, but is a shock to the system of anyone who liked the movies or the books, and to whom Galadriel is kind of a Virgin Mary character, and she's the ideal queen. She's a medieval ideal of what a queen should be. Okay.
Yep.
And some humorist said we should all pay homage to Celeborn, the husband of Galadriel, because in the movie she's been married to him for many hundreds of years, and in the movie she is gracious and loving and opposed to the Dark Lord.
Yep.
And willing to diminish and die rather than be tempted by the One Ring. Whereas in Rings of Power, when she's young and unmarried, she is just a witch. She's just a terrible person, selfish, arrogant, bad leader, doesn't care about men in her command. And so Celeborn must be the greatest guy ever because he must have reformed her.
Yep.
I thought that was hilarious. Now, well, again, I haven't seen the show, and I'm not making any comment about it.
No, I haven't.
I don't make comments about shows I haven't seen, but I have read the joke, and I'm commenting on that. And I think the joke was hilarious.
Fair enough. No, the show, I follow a few YouTubers that commented on it and offered some analysis, and it just doesn't sound worth watching.
I felt the same way about the second Doctor Strange movie, and I'm a Doctor Strange fan from way back. Doctor Strange was, in fact, the first comic I ever bought with my own money and read as a child. Okay, so he's actually my favorite character from the comics.
Oh, okay.
And I thought the first movie was okay. I thought the first movie was fairly true to the original, and I really liked Benedict Cumberbatch's portrayal of him. I thought they picked the perfect actor for him. Not as good as getting Ian McKellen to play Gandalf, because that guy actually was Gandalf. Not as good as they got the guy that played Sam, because that actually was Sam,
Marvel did some good casting.
In the movie, I thought Aragorn was miscast. I thought that guy did not look like a weather-beaten hero. He did not look like a guy who had laid in ditches for 20 years and was an outdoorsman. He didn't look like, he just didn't look like the description in the book.
Didn't look rugged enough.
For one thing, he just wasn't old enough.
Oh, okay.
For another, he didn't have a majestic sense of dignity. And for a third, they decided that to be sympathetic, he had to suffer from self-doubt. The one thing Aragorn never suffers from, because he is an idealized version of a medieval king. He's like King Arthur, except he doesn't have a disloyal wife, or better yet, he's like Galahad. Oh, and I should mention, it is my belief that Tolkien was also writing his belief as to what the Middle Ages, the story of the Middle Ages, should have been if it had had a happier ending. Because I think Gondor is supposed to be his version of Constantinople, and the forces of Mordor are the forces of the Paganims that are attacking from the south and are destined to overthrow the Constantinople. And the severed kingdom, the north and the south in Middle Earth, the kingdom of Arnor and the kingdom of Gondor were estranged from one another. And Arnor fell into disrepair, and nothing exists now but a few monuments. And the kings have passed into the shadows. Well, Aragorn is the direct lineal descendant of the last of those kings, and actually has a legal claim to the kingship, which you might remember if you saw the movie.
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Well, what Tolkien is setting up is, what if Charlemagne, as the last of the Roman emperors, had gone to the aid of Constantinople, or Charlemagne or someone of the sort, Emperor Otto or something, and brought the entire body of Christendom with him, and not just the Franks who wanted to loot the place, okay, and had staved off, with supernatural help, mind you, because Gondor is not saved by the strength of the might of arms. The might of arms is necessary. There are things that happen, like the magical knife used by Pippin, a little short little man, overlooked by the Dark Lord, by the Dark Lord's henchman, the king of the Nazgul.
Yep.
And Eowyn is, she's like a character out of Shakespeare's Macbeth, where the Nazgul has the blessing on him that no man born of woman can slay him. And when she throws her helmet aside and says, "Well, I'm not I'm not a man, and neither is the Hobbit, by the way. It's a brilliant scene.
Yeah.
And I think Tolkien also wanted to have, when Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, which is also in Macbeth, for the forest to actually get up and besiege the castle, which he does have.
He does.
When all the Ents march on Orthanc.
Mm-hmm.
The Wizard's Tower of Saruman the White.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got a number of little tongue-in-cheek things of, the Siege of Constantinople if it had been done a little bit better, or some of the battles and so on from Shakespeare and so on.
Mm-hmm.
There's little flourishes like that. Now his elves are a very interesting literary take, because he's trying to get the northern idea of these things as luminous supernatural beings. Basically something like unfallen man.
Yep.
They're longer lived than humans. They're closer to nature. They have a spirit that's not going to perish until the world perishes. We're so used to them from like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, and people forget that before Tolkien, elves were Santa's helpers and the little creatures from Midsummer Night's Dream by Tolkien. They were kind of diminished and made cutesy pie, made into little butterfly winged beings by the Victorians. And their original pagan kind of demigod-like stature was forgotten, you see. Now, what Tolkien did, again, is he tried to make them into realistic creatures that could actually walk under the bright sun and cast a shadow. Mm-hmm. And that's why his unlike Mallory's Mort d'Arthur, Tolkien actually has people realistically travel over realistic distances, suffering from corns and bunions, and so on and so forth, if you take my meaning. The reason why I say it's a modern realistic novel is because all the people act like people. And that includes dwarves, elves, and hobbits, and people who aren't people at all, if you see what I'm saying.
I do.
And when he invents the hobbits, that's a perfect symbol of the comfortable middle-class squirearchy or lower upper class of England, of what a comfortable life was supposed to be like in the Edwardian age. It's the English ideal that was being lost by modernization. But he also has the Ents, who are a perfect example of a crusty old bachelor.
Yep.
Who are very slow and very patient. And there are people I know who are like that, okay? Mm-hmm. The idea that dwarves are hard-working miners is not new to him. But the fact that they are hardy and enduring and lust for gold was brought into very clear delimitation by him.
Yep.
I think the movie made a mistake by making short jokes about the dwarf. There's one scene in the book where all three of the Aragorn the man, Legolas the elf, and Gimli the dwarf are, without horses, are trying to track down the kidnapped hobbits because they don't know which hobbits were kidnapped by which. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to track down a band of orcs. And so they're just running day and night without pause. And what the movie did not have, which I would have liked, is a scene with the elf and the dwarf, belay that, the human and the elf clutching their knees and panting out of breath, while the dwarf, still wearing his chainmail, trudges on by them without slowing. Because in the book, they're creatures of great endurance and great hardihood, and they're not just short men, if you know what I'm saying.
Yep.
I don't think the movie did that correctly. I don't think the movie did Faramir correctly. I don't think the movie the movie certainly did not do Theoden correctly. The whole point of the character of Theoden in the book is that he was too old to go to war. He was a long, gray-bearded man. Mm-hmm. That the counsels of Wormtongue had weakened his will, and that Gandalf restores his spirit to him. In the movie, they portrayed this by having there be a light show, and the guy stands up and he's like in his 50s, rather than being in his 80s or 90s. But that doesn't happen in the book. He doesn't change shape from a drooling madman, like a drooling basket case who can't even talk. He changes from being a coward to being a brave man, but he's too old, and he's going to die when he goes to battle, and everyone knows it. He's doomed. You see. Mm-hmm. He doesn't make it, by the way. Just spoilers. he dies on the Pelennor Fields. He dies in front of Gondor.
So we've been talking for about an hour. Any of Lewis's or Tolkien's books you wouldn't recommend?
I will alienate all my Lewis friends when I say Today We Choose Faces. unless that's the Zelazny book by a very similar name. I can't get through it. I've read it once. I tried to read it again.
Till We Have Faces?
It's a story of
Yep.
It's a story of Cupid and Psyche. I think I got the title wrong. It's not. You can see how bad it.
It's Till We Have.
What's that?
Till We Have Faces.
We Have Faces.
I read it.
I
didn't mind it.
There's a Zelazny book called Today We Choose Faces, which is actually a better book, in my opinion. Till We Have Faces was Lewis's experiment to try to show what a realistic version of the Cupid and Psyche myth might have looked like had it actually taken place. In the same way that he was trying to, like reverse engineer what the real myth would have been like, and he uses it to make a very clear point, very well said, about how a human sin makes it so that we can't face the gods. They can't become visible to us because there's something in us that makes them so that they have to be hidden. It doesn't have any of the charm or delight of his children's book. It doesn't have any of the realism or the imagination of his science fiction book, and it doesn't have any of the Greek flavor of Greek myths to my eye, because he's trying to tap into an earlier strata of mythology where the mother goddess is just a black stone, for example, which anthropologists say is there, but it's just not. It's not romantic. It's not dramatic. It's not interesting.
Okay.
And the main character is basically so petty and distasteful to me that I can't muster any sympathy for her, even though I understand what he's trying to do as a writer, and I think does it very skillfully. It's just not to my taste.
Fair enough.
As for Tolkien, I liked pretty much everything he writes, including the fragmentary books put together by his son, because a one-page fragment that breaks off in the middle of the sentence written by Tolkien is better than most people's three-volume trilogies. Okay, he's a really good writer. He really is evocative of a mood that I just don't see anywhere else.
Fair enough.
Some medieval writers approached it. Some modern realistic writers approach it. Homer and Milton are in his same camp, but he is a man of the modern age, and he speaks to the modern age, both good and bad, by looking at it through the lens of prehistory, of fantasy. And I think he has more to say about the modern age than James Joyce when he writes Ulysses, for example.
Okay.
Or anyone like that. Tolkien, by being a faithful Catholic, has a proper view of humankind, a proper understanding of right and wrong, and he can write a story that's entirely based on a sacramental view of life. By being a sacramental view, I mean that a physical reality can portray or embody a spiritual truth. So you can have things like a mountain get mad at mountain climbers and throw snow at them without it being absurd. It turns into a very scary scene.
Yep.
Because you can feel the malice coming from nature. Nature is not a machine in Tolkien. Nature is not a dead thing in Tolkien. And that's a sense that modern people have lost. They've lost respect for nature because they lost respect for God.
Yep.
You see? So the answer is a resounding no. There's nothing of Lewis or Tolkien that I would say is not worth reading.
Fair enough. From my experience of reading Lewis, yes, I would tend to agree. I've enjoyed all of the things I've read. So,
if I were you, I would try again. At least try reading Voyage of the Dawn Treader, even if you don't read any of the other children's books. I think you will find it charming. I think you'll find it deeper than it seems to be.
I'll give it a go.
Okay.
I'll give them a go. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed the show, and we'll be back in a week. Thanks for joining me, John.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.